close.
All right, let us begin.
Okay, I think I was talking about the, like, how they told the upper members that that the transit was not actually a spaceship and it was suicide instead. That's what I left off. That happened around 1993, and then there was question over Mangrose and Dre's leadership. A bunch of the French and Swiss members left, suspecting their money was funding DeMambro's lifestyle instead of the actual, like, churches and buildings and stuff like that. And then, after that, there were the holographics that I talked about, where they would use that to like project spiritual figures or things. There were rumors spinning around that they were fake, and the guy that made the holograms confirmed that they were fake, and then him and his wife left the cult. And they didn't leave. They distanced themselves from DeMambro, and then they had a kid in the order named Christopher. Actually, I should start with this. This is DeMambro, and this is his son or his daughter.
So it's technically a daughter, but then he said that she was a flawed being because she was born from a mortal woman, and so therefore she was flawed because she was not a man. So I'm pretty sure her original name was Alice, and then he changed it to Emmanuel. But there was a lot of discrepancies. He like saw her as this like divine being that was kind of going to be this like religious figure of the new age, and then was kind of raising her to be that for the cult, and like was calling her Emmanuel and stuff. And then by the time that she was like 12 years old, she was really going against it all and really didn't like it. But to my understanding, DeMambro had 5 kids, and to my understanding, they all did pass away regarding the cult. I know that she definitely did, but there was a lot of Emmanuels. So yeah.
So the guy that made the holograms, I think that's his last name. I don't remember, but him and his wife had a baby, and they named their son Christopher Emmanuel, the same name that DeMambro's child had.
Yeah.
And DeMambro was not very happy with that because of this, like, thought his child's like this chosen one thing, and he ended up killing the baby.
Yeah.
Which very much heightened the tensions in the cult at that point.
When it was like 2 months old.
Yeah, the baby was not very old. That's actually the not death certificate, but like obituary, I guess.
It was found on like this website regarding where to find people's graves.
Yeah.
But there's like so much that they burned regarding evidence of like who ended up passing away that it was really hard to find any evidence on like specific.
So after that happened, DeMambro became very, very, very paranoid and tried to speed up the like transit preparations very quickly. So it was most likely that they started actively preparing like the rituals for the suicides around late 1993. That's the most likely scenario based on the sources that I found, but there's no confirmation because the information is not very well distributed. Okay, so the final outcome of the cult was a series of mass suicides. There was one in 1994 where 68 members had died. That was their first quote, transit attempt to reach the Sirius star. So it was basically like their souls would go to this outer place, and I don't know. It wasn't very clear about what that would accomplish, but that was the goal of this. So the way they did that was they either poisoned the members or had the members suicide themselves with this gun. This was the main gun that was actually the only gun that was used in the first mass suicide. And it was one of the guns they got with the silencer back in 1993-ish.
And the thing with that gun too is that only one bullet could be loaded at a time. So
each member most likely had to prepare their own. There was another, so that was like the main one. That was the 68 members who passed away. And then the second one was the Winter Solstice in 1995, where 16 more people died in the same way. And this was the one that like really brought a lot of attention For some reason, the first one didn't really get that much attention. But the second one did, and it brought kind of all of this stuff out to the light, so. After the suicides were committed, I don't know who it was, but one of the members of Four Times burnt down the buildings that they committed in. And so there wasn't much information they could find because everything that was in it was completely burnt down, as you talked about earlier with the ashes and him leaving nothing. That was part of the member's quote. There was a final one where 5 more members died in the same way, 3 years later. So this was kind of after the investigation-ish.
Yeah, so with the investigation, it was all done very poorly, by basically every single government, the countries that were involved. So Switzerland and Canada both did a very, very poor job. With the first one, I believe it's that they waited 10 days until after it took place to begin investigating.
So there could
And
have been evidence tampered
so
with.
there was a lot of evidence tampered with, and even when they did begin the investigation, to my understanding, they didn't even mark off the sites to keep the public out. So like the public was able to very easily go in. And I know one of the mass suicides that took place in Canada, there was a reporter who went in to report on it and was very surprised because there was no one there, but there was nothing keeping him from just going into the site. And so he found some pretty awful things when he went to go and report on it, and there was nothing stopping him from taking any evidence or tampering with things. And then the other thing is when they were doing some of that investigation, I believe it was one of the treasurers of the order, and they went to go, like the officials who were conducting the investigation went to go interview her, and she talked about it in one of the documentaries, but she said that it was very clear that they were trying to spin a specific story on what took place, possibly to make them look less bad. If they had any affiliation regarding just like how it wasn't caught beforehand. And she said that a lot of her answers, if it didn't cater to the story that they wanted to be told regarding the investigation, they just wouldn't write down her answers. So I think part of that was also they were very much trying to spin it as a mass suicide rather than a mass murder. And especially with like the gun and the one singular bullet, a lot of the people who had family members who died in these events believe that they did not actually commit suicide and that there was someone else who was shooting the bullets, but that is not how the investigation was conducted. And so it's not really how it is reported in a lot of sources.
Yeah, so these are just the images of the investigation. That when it's from so these two are both from the first. As suicide, and then this is just when you kind of working through the debris. And so those are some of the bodies that they recovered from the second mass suicide, where there wasn't burning down one of the chapels, but some of the bodies, there were 16 bodies, and children that were laid out in like a star formation. Aside from the building, and they weren't burnt, so those are the bodies they recovered from that. Yeah, this is.
Personal anecdotes. I'll start. So I wrote a little snippet, but I think that what is truly terrifying about this cult is the exploitation which took place through pure lies, with like the green screen and the props and just like the very theatrical performance in order to soothe people's egos and just like attack that. And I said the cult took advantage of the human ego and used it for financial gain. And I think that their use of technology and props to convince its followers of its importance is really scary. And that people are so desperate to survive and to feel as though they are all knowing that they will believe anything that reinforces that idea. And then what I found particularly tragic when I was researching is that when they were taking legal action about the mass suicide and specifically like the burnings of the buildings, it came out that some of the children that survived the event were begging for their lives from their parents as the buildings were actively burning. And it was actually debated whether or not the kids should be held responsible for some of the burning of those buildings, which I thought was absolutely absurd, that was even something they were considering in the investigation. And then not to mention that it also came out that the parents had their children under the influence of drugs when they were burning some of these buildings as well. So I just found that to be extremely tragic. And then The Order of the Solar Temple really took everything from its members. It exploited them for when they wanted to be seen as something greater. It took their lives. It separated them from what they once had for life and while they were in the cult, and then separated them from life entirely. And I think it's really, really tragic and sad and just really hard to research.
I think, sorry, my main thing with this vote was that I think it's a really great example of manipulation. Most of the people who were in the cult were very educated and very successful people, and they weren't dumb. They weren't, usually you wouldn't consider the people that were in the cult susceptible to this kind of a thing. But just the way the manipulation works was just a really tragic example of how intelligent people can be drawn into this, like these destructive belief systems by people knowing how to prey on their egos. Yeah, I just again with doing like the theatricality of it, just how dramatic it all was. And how most of it didn't really point to like, in the beginning, there was some evidence that Jure did believe what he was talking about. There wasn't much that DeMambro actually believed it after he initially started the cult. And the fact that they attempted to cover all of the financial exploitation, all of the things that they did with the final mass suicides is just disgusting to me. Considering that there was like near the end, it was pretty obvious that Jure nor DeMambro, neither of them really believed what they were saying. Yeah, I just think it's a good example of why like critical thinking, transparency, and spiritual movements is all very important.
There are sources.
I see it was a tough one, interesting, but tough to.
Yeah, and there's like so many different small aspects that you just can't cover. It's just really sad.
It has every example. We should say it's a cult.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Any questions? Any questions? Yeah, great job. And thank you for kind of splitting it halfway. That was tough, but I appreciate it. Nice job. No, very good.
Same thing.
They're the same.
I want,
You
it's
get
also,
2 copies of everything.
it's one in the scrapbook. The thing I do find interesting, how they wanted to make it a mass suicide.
Yeah.
So, and it's like people simple, they want to turn that into a mass suicide when it was obviously so much fun.
It was like very clearly not, and
There's a
then
lot of evidence that they were poisoned.
There's a lot of evidence.
Poisoned and not actually.
yeah, and I just thought it was like, there was someone who was doing the math on one of the documentaries I watched as well. When he was talking about like how many bullets would have been used for how many people that passed away and how long it would have taken to reload all of those bullets. And he was like, there's just no way that all of that would have been done on every single individual that happened
With a single shot pistol.
with this thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good story. Though. All right. And Fiona, you ready?
Yep.
Let me get this one down.
My notes are handwritten, is that okay?
Perfect. Give me one sec. Okay.
Okay. So I said cult relic. For kind of the image, that is the tongue and jawbone of Saint Anthony. 30 years after his death, his body was exhumed and it's found the tongue hadn't decomposed. During his life, he was praised globally for his sermons. And so that was thought like, oh, this means something. And that tongue kind of went through a tour of New York City churches in 2013. Foreshadowing. Okay, so we're gonna cover the origin of essentially what it's going to be, exactly what the belief structure was concerning relics and human remains, how pilgrims during the 10th century factored into the growth and spread, the art it created, the architecture it fostered, the follow the money, how the law incorporated things, the market it all created, how everything fell down, and what relics are today. As for these images, these are the 4 different heads of John the Baptist. Yep.
4 different?
4 different heads. France, Serbia, Italy, somewhere else.
So women should partly be called foreshadow.
Oh.
Okay, so the origin. So for a long time in Christianity, messing with remains was taboo. Instead, they worshipped shrines, burial sites. At the time, there was a longing for saint patronage, individuals who lived aspirational lives in Christ, who after death could put a good word for them in heaven. They were viewed as more accessible than God. And so this cult of saints was kind of rising parallel to this cult of relics. Um, and this, and at the same time, there's also a rise in Christian martyrs. And these martyrs were elevated to saint status. They would form churches around these martyrs and where they're buried. But as Christianity spread north, it became difficult for new converts to access these holy shrines. So it was a way to spread Christianity further and give people that access to that same divine power that was believed to be held in these bodies. It's also a time of high anxiety of the end of the world. There was a lot of doom prophets taking context from the Bible that the end was coming and eternal damnation was near if you didn't get your life together and were the perfect Christian. Also, people were dying left and right. There was a lot of fear about plague, famine. It was not the easiest time to be alive. People died young. There was a lot of pressure. And that same, and just kind of like how people are obsessed with like modern day pulp culture artifacts, where like you get a prop from your favorite show. It's a way of like communing with those characters, or like the famous instrument of your favorite musician. This was actually very similar in terms of that frenzy. It was a way of accessing the divine, the people from these stories they had grown up hearing about, as well as real life people. It was tangible proof of their beliefs. The height of all this was definitely the Romanesque period. This would have been so like the 1000s to kind of the 1300s. Definitely kind of before the Black Plague, before the Renaissance. So there is a picture of the Black Death, which wasn't quite around this time period, but which gave you a sense of what it was feeling. That is a milk grotto in Bethlehem. An example of just kind of people wanting to travel and see these places. That is an example of a martyr. I think his name is Saint, I have written down. Saint Polycarp. He was almost burned alive, but the fire like angled away from him like a shield. Only the smell of incense instead of burning human flesh. And so he would just kill with daggers. That's the idea. Like, oh, you want to burn me at the stake? Burn me. And the fire didn't burn him. And then that is Saint Eustace, reliquary hymn. His stories, like he converted to Christianity after seeing the cross between the antlers of a stag he was hunting. So yeah. So over time, it just became these huge things. So this is like the actual relic belief system. There are 3 kinds of relics. First class, so bodily remains of holy figures, or things having to do with the passion of Christ, which is just Jesus, Son of God, being crucified. For example, the true cross, which is that little image right in center. There's also second class relics, so the objects associated with holy figures that they come into contact with, including the instruments of their torture. Torture is a very big thing when it comes to Christian martyrs and Christian saints. Right there, we have the chain of St. Peter. Finally, third class relics, which is just anything that's come into contact with a first or second class relic. So you can, in a way, manufacture third class relics. And skull right there is just the skull of St. Ivo. Anything else? Yes. Pilgrims. The medieval times was a very big thing for pilgrims. It was a little bit safer to travel. And there was a whole movement of people traveling to visit sacred sites. It was kind of viewed as like a spiritual retreat. Also with the Crusades, the Holy Roman Empire, there was more access for where they could go. They could visit the Holy Land. However, places like Rome was a lot more convenient. So they would make these journeys, sometimes with more penance, to see blessings, a cure. Um, and then in 1300, the Pope offered indulgences, so essentially get out of hell free cards to any pilgrim who made the journey to go to Rome. And so it wasn't just spiritual, it was encouraged by the religion and actively endorsed by the heads of the religion. Um, Pilgrims often wore like wide brim hats for sun protection, of course, cloak, a staff, maybe a satchel. Some even carried personal shrines. And then monasteries all along the road would offer food, lodging, souvenirs, mass. It was a huge migration. And so these pilgrims would technically be the version of kind of who the cult was looking for in a way. Yeah. Down there is a picture of kind of what the pilgrims look like. Martin Luther actually made a similar pilgrimage journey to Rome. And then over there is an example. It's a very sumptuous personal shrine, but a personal shrine nonetheless. The art. Relics were contained in reliquaries, which were crafted like expensive materials because the reliquaries meant to reflect the value of what they contained. So it formed a huge artistic industry across Europe and Byzantium, to the point where like much of our medieval different kind of relics, artifacts, are reliquaries from this period. They were often formed from gold, silver, enamel, gems, depicted with narrative scenes of like the life of that saint or the passion of Christ. They were formed maybe in caskets or chastens. Maybe they were smaller in lockets. So it was lots and lots of diversity. When rock crystal became formed, it was a huge thing. So you could actually see the relic instead of just containing it. And so here we have, in the middle is a rock crystal reliquary of Saint Sebastian, with inside being a piece of bone fragment. Here we have an example of the chast or casket reliquary, with objects depicting the Passion of Christ. And my favorite one is right there on the farthermost left. It was a reliquary pendant given to Queen Margaret of Sicily, and it was blessed by the Bishop Reginald of Bath. There's an inscription saying that it was the blood of Saint Thomas the Martyr. It's referring to Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was a friend of the Bishop Reginald. And the idea is Bishop Reginald gave this piece of his friend to the Queen Margaret, who's the father of her daughter-in-law had murdered Thomas Becket. So I thought that was the most crazy petty thing ever. I love it so much. So yes. The architecture. Because the mass influx of pilgrims coming into these churches, they had to renovate in order to accommodate them. One of the most common examples of renovations is the creation of ambulatories, where kind of a round space where pilgrims could walk around the relic and like absorb their power without affecting the daily activities of the monastery or church. So that's an example. I think this is probably the best example where like relic would be on a podium, walk around. Here is a blueprint of kind of what that would look like in the typical Romanesque church. So yeah, it was a huge change to change, not only how people operate, but the kind of places they operated in. But where did they get the money for all these renovations? Well, it was customary for pilgrims to bring offerings, sometimes in the form of like of art. Pilgrims were huge in economies. They would come, pay for lodging, pay for food. They were operating in these towns. It wasn't just, I mean, don't get me wrong, having a relic in your town was a huge point of pride. It put you on the map. But it also got you revenues and tourists. It's kind of like the idea of like if you had a rock star that agreed to only play in your city. Like imagine the restaurants and just how much money that would bring to your city. One very interesting example is the picture on the left, which is a picture of Santiago de Compostela. So allegedly they had found, they're claimed to have found the bones of Saint James and that resulted in them getting huge prestige. It was one of the most significant pilgrimage sites in Europe because they found the bones of St. James. And I just thought it was a cool relic, so I put it in there. I don't have a, I don't remember which one that one was. Then the law came in. So in the second, so in the, it's okay, 787 AD, the Second Council of Nicaea mandated that every church have a relic to show off. Charlemagne, who was adored relics and was huge in getting them to be sold and traded, also mandated that every altar have a relic. So suddenly having a relic wasn't just something to have in a church because you wanted to. Suddenly every single church across Europe needed to have the bones and bodily remains of a saint or something of their possessions in their possession. However, people were worried about the authenticity, and so they mandated that it had to be endorsed by a local bishop. Over on the right here is Charlemagne, on the left of that council, and in the middle is this preserved head of Saint Catherine. As legend goes, two thieves with holy purpose came in and stole her head from its, I don't know how to pronounce it, sepulcher. You'll see the spelling later. A Christian tomb. And when guards came in to, because they were carrying like a bag or a statue, and when guards came to expect the thief, saying, "Hey, what the heck you're doing?" When they opened the bag, it was said it would turn into like blossoms and petals. Then when the guards left, it returned to the state of a holy pet. And that's where it is. So, think out. Which brings me to the market. So, hi. What's your question? What happened to the churches if they didn't? That's an excellent question. I have not found anything about that. I think it depends on their reach. Because, like, for example, okay, if it's law, but if you're so rural that no one really cares.
Cool.
Yes. Poor guys.
It was big business to sell the third or,
Yes.
yeah, so you just buy something that touched the.
Mhm.
Mm.
But anyway, so this created a huge market, especially if you were too poor to purchase an authentic relic. You turned to some other means, and those means were there. So this idea of stealing relics was called porta sacra, which means holy theft in Latin. And because this is from the slide, Martin Warren. The most famous or most infamous was a bishop named Deusdedona. So it was a family business, and they would raid sepulchres, Christian tombs, and hide the body at his family home. Actually, it's his brother, multiple brothers, and they would smuggle it to the churches. Often these churches were over the Alps, so again, very rural. But it was a long, long trek. Their most famous acquisitions, we'll call it, was like Saint Marcellinus and Saint Peter for the private secretary to Charlemagne's son. And so even the people in like very high political power who had probably the means, it was just a big tomb raid. I know one of the earlier popes during the time period is actually placing like sanctions to try and limit the amount of trading going on, because Roman locals were so tired of people just raiding and pillaging their city for relics. Charlemagne was like, nah, it's fine though, because he really, really loved relics. These are just some kind of cool examples of like the really like, just how ornate these displays and relics can be. It's like, and then here an example of like just porta sacra, holy theft. Yeah. So the fall. So a lot of this changed after the Black Death and the plague, because human remains didn't really keep you from infection, and it was a time of great disillusionment for people because it didn't save them. And so with this came also the Enlightenment, scientific revolution. However, also Reformation with Martin Luther was a huge factor. Martin Luther was one of the largest people, figures who denounced the Catholic Church, and a lot of the abuses he was doing at the time. Um, he criticized relics as idolatry, and his idea is the only relic worth worshiping was the word God or the Bible. Everything else was just kind of hearsay. And he condemned. Yes, he also may have brought up how suspicious it was. There were 4 heads of John the Baptist, and how there were so many splinters of the true cross, and enough to build like a carriage wheel or something. So for the pictures, we have a very famous painting representing the secular revolution, the Enlightenment, and that's Copernicus' model of Helios of the universe. So the present. Relics are still very much a huge part of the Catholic Church's operations. It didn't actually stop requiring relics to be in churches until 1969. So for context, that is over 1,000 years of every single Catholic church you have ever seen requiring to have a relic. We would have a few in the Cathedral St. Helena. But today there's also just like examples of medieval art. Much of our artifacts from this time period were these reliquaries because they're just so widespread. These are top picture is a picture of seminarians looking at the bones of St. Francis of Assisi. So we just recently kind of like they're now like review. That is a picture of a Pope kissing the reliquary of the blood of St. Janarius, and the idea is like every certain amount of time it like occasionally liquefies. And that's a bone fragment in that kind of decorative flower pin of St. Trico of Vila. My evaluation. Keep in mind, this was 1,000 years ago. The printing press was invented in around like I think 1456. And so much of our understanding of what was going on in the inner workings of this time is not nearly as recent as that of modern cults. And so it is very difficult to pin it down to a cult structure. For example, there is no real charismatic leader you can pin it down to, though there were a lot of powerful advocates and bishops at the time advocating for reliquaries. Same time, though, I think for me, one of the most clear evidence of a modern cult from what we've seen is leaving your life behind. And it's, whilst you could argue that pilgrimage was a form of that, it's not nearly as clear cut. Maybe the monastic life, monasteries at the time, maybe. Many pilgrims who went on these journeys, a lot of them did end up becoming monks, those who could at least. But because there's just not that much literature out there and evidence, it's difficult to say. And so I'm honestly not very sure. I wouldn't surprise me if maybe certain convents were maybe a little bit more exploitative, maybe a little bit more harsh. But in terms of all of Europe, it's a little hard to say. But yeah, the dead praying
Yeah,
mantis.
that's pretty gruesome.
It's the realm of praying.
Yes.
The relic of a praying man. Very good.
We're all the little ants. Maybe. And this is my favorite relic. It was the cloak of Saint Juan. It's a Puerto Rican saint. The idea was Mother Mary came to him in like a vision, like, oh, you need to build a church here. And it's like, said, I'll tell you what to do. And she told him to go collect these flowers from this field, and he carried them in a cloak. And then when he came over to the authorities to say why he's gonna build a church, he dropped the cloak, the flowers all spilled out, and here was this image of what is now Our Lady of Guadalupe, with the red paint on her part to indicate she's the Virgin, the belt to indicate pregnant, stars, blah. But the idea for this is a cactus cloak, and logically it should have like degraded away over the years. I haven't found much evidence citing otherwise. And I'm not sure, this might have been a rumor. But if you look at the microscope, the pigment's like hovering above. I don't know, but I like the story. It's fun. So yeah, the cultural relic.
Any questions? Yeah, there's elements like in the offerings. And things.
Yeah. Yes, I think they think there's a very strong argument for exploitation and that gotta build those churches somehow. And I think there is a very strong argument for the Catholic Church overall being very exploitative. But I think honestly, the most exploited were the body parts and the remains of people who had their tombs unceremoniously raided. Who knows whose bones these are, guys? So yeah, I think the real exploits are the bones.
So are you saying we should get a relic?
And yeah, we should require every class.
Every class,
I
new school, right? They should
Science,
like have a
science
relic.
freshman on a pilgrimage.
That's like their
Just
induction.
goodbye.
Guys, we need an ambulatory.
All right.
Yes,
Good job. Thank you for the nice work. Yes, if you go to churches across, I have seen fingers, just kind of there.
I think we have a remnant of the True Cross in Helena as some vials and stuff.
So, man, yeah. Could build a thousand. Steven, you ready?
You can go if you want, it's,
That's not had done that.
The Anabaptist speak out.
I got no pictures, but I can go.
Did anyone finish?
I have all the like the information there, so let's go today and it's probably gonna last.
Let's finish it tomorrow.
Yeah.
Anybody want to get started today? Then we'll go. And you want to go? Start?
Anabaptists, they like the Catholic Church.
Huh?
The Anabaptists love.
Oh,
the
yeah.
Catholic Church.
Actually, it kind of fits in. This is our perfect timing. I think I put it down.
The original Anabaptists, not the German ones.
Oh, no, you're online. Here we go. Oh, with the,
Yes, the Mr. Rebellion, yeah.
right, just noticed the hammer and sickle.
Yeah, see, they really liked original socialism and communism, but like it did not execute it very well. As it tends to happen. Corruption, they don't know.
What did I do here wrong? What do you? Why are you doing this to me?
I hate her.
All right, here we go.
Oh,
Let
okay,
me go back.
that slide's not important, this is, okay, well,
Let me-
Mr. Rebellion.
me
So
try-
I'm doing like the Anabaptist, but specifically the little region of them in Germany. So they aren't your typical Anabaptist, because when you hear Anabaptist, some like modern examples would be like Amish and Hutterites,
Yeah, okay.
yes. But these guys were not peaceful, they were not like the Amish. So origins, it kind of started in 16th century Switzerland. The big like Anabaptist belief and why it's called Anabaptism is they are very against infant baptism. They firmly believe you have to be old enough to consent to the baptism. It's kind of like a new birth. One of the big documents for this was the Schlieben Confession in 1527. This is what heavily inspired the Anabaptists in Germany. It was a confession of faith by Michael Sattler, a German monk, and he was arrested and executed. But this whole thing denounced the Catholic Church and kind of like the hierarchy and power structure. That was the big belief. They were very anti like this hierarchy and how it worked, and they believed everything should be like more shared and like together. So Michael Hoffman he lived in Strasbourg, France, and he claimed to be one of the witnesses in Revelations. And he said, he was a Anabaptist preacher in Strasbourg, and he said they needed to create a new Jerusalem. However, he was eventually arrested by the church because they were like, "Hey, you can't be saying this. This isn't right." And he died. They were going to execute him, but they decided they couldn't because his whole thing was like, he'd become like a martyr for these people and like it would only like strengthen their belief. However, he ended up dying in prison, which then only continued to strengthen their belief. But he also said after he would die in 1534, Jesus would come back, especially in their New Jerusalem of Strasbourg, but he never came back. Then this lovely guy, John Mathis, took over for Hoffman. He was kind of like his right-hand man, and he claimed to be the other witness. And he said, no, the reason Jesus didn't come back is because we're in the wrong area. Strasbourg is at the New Jerusalem. We have to go to Münster. So they left because Münster was starting to become like a Anabaptist haven because there was another guy there. named, oh my God, Rothman, John Rothman, who was an Anabaptist preacher, and he was good friends with this man named Bernard Knipperdoeling, he had control of the printing press in town, so they would like transcribe all of his sermons and kind of spread them everywhere. So they were really spreading this Anabaptist belief in Munster. And the cool thing about Munster was it was this town that was surrounded by these walls, which will be very important for later. So this is Mathis. And so as he began to rise to power, he claimed not only was he the other witness, but he spoke for God, and that so everyone should just listen to him. And he had his second in command, John von Leyden, who will really be like, he is the cult leader when we get to that. Like, sure, Mathis and Hoffman were a little up there, but Van Leyden really exploited some people. So he moved everyone there. In Munster, they were ruled by a prince bishop. A lot of prince bishops were the Catholic Church were like appointed little cities to kind of rule over, but they usually weren't there. Franz von Waldeck was a prince bishop. He ruled over Munster, but he was never there. So Mathis and Knipperdoeling, Van Leyden, and Rothman, they were kind of able to do whatever they wanted. And the big thing Mathis did is he had this big sermon kind of claiming that Munster was unholy. So yeah, the big sermon, they had to cleanse Munster of the unrighteous, and you were either, he wanted to kill people originally. He was like, if you were unholy, you'd be killed. But Knipperdoeling was like, Van Leyden was like, hey, that's probably not a very good idea. So instead it was be baptized or be forced out, and people would kind of try to protest this because they were like, that's not right. And Mathis would have them like executed immediately. Like there was this blacksmith, he dragged him like his body all around the town, like kind of stapled him to a wall as like a symbol as what would happen. Yeah, so Waldeck eventually heard about Mathis running the people out of his city because eventually, word started to get to him of all these people forced out of the cold city gates. And so he decided to go and take his city back. He had like a whole tiny little army, a couple thousand. Mathis found out they were coming, and he told everyone that God spoke to him, and I think it was around Easter, and that he and 30 men would go out on some miracle and defeat this army. They were defeated in moments. It was 30 like untrained civilians of Munster against a prince bishop in his entire army. Did not end very well. So Van Leyden, his second in command, got to take over, and Van Leyden kind of let this get to his head a little bit. It did not go very well.
Let's quit right there.
Cool.
We just got a couple minutes and then we'll get the band
Yeah.
and whatnot.
Mathis also
Kind of
called-
good.
Yeah, Mathis called that like his sacrifice. Everyone said that was his sacrifice, and he called himself the new David. So
Of course. Yeah. All right, mini applause for halfway. All right, good. And then tomorrow we'll finish this. Nice job. Yeah, and that, it fits in very well with Fiona, so that's good.
That's true.